Today I attempt my biggest Necron conversion yet, and it's coming right up.
Necrons!
Nick speaking, and welcome to this video. Right, today I am going to convert this Bayard's Revenge 35-year anniversary 40k miniature for my Necron army. My initial idea is to use this Necron Overlord miniature for this conversion because, well, I don't have this miniature in my army, and I thought he's got quite a good standing pose where I could stand him on top of the Orc instead of the Black Templar. Now, I wasn't quite sure exactly how I was going to do this conversion. I potentially was just going to have the Overlord standing on the Orc, but I want people to know that this is the anniversary miniature, so I was thinking I would keep the Black Templar in the miniature somehow. My initial idea was that he would be holding this Black Templar by the neck, exchanging maybe the orb hand for a hand which was grabbing his neck, sort of holding him up in the air. I thought that would be pretty heroic. So I unboxed the miniature, I took all the pieces off of the sprue, and of course I cleaned up all of the mould lines. I also clipped the Necron off of the sprue as well and cleaned up the mould lines there. So I ended up with 3 piles of plastic: the Overlord, the Black Templar, and of course the Orc on the base. I then started with the Orc, and I glued all of the Orc pieces together, with the exception of actually gluing him to the base section. I thought it would just be easier to paint him if he wasn't glued. So I just used plastic glue, of course, and I glued the Orc together. With the Orc done, I looked at the Overlord's legs, because of course my vision is the Overlord is going to stand on top of the Orc. Now, there are some rocks attached to one of his feet where he's supposed to be standing on them, so my first job was to remove those rocks. I just cut them off very gently with my knife. I then had a look at where I could actually glue the legs onto the Orc, and that's when I discovered that the marine foot is actually attached to the claw. It's actually like the inside of the marine. It's slightly odd, but basically the marine's foot goes over this section on the claw. So I had to cut that little foot off of the claw, and then I had to glue that little piece onto the foot. I then started to put the Necron together, mainly the legs and the cloak. Then had another look to see where this Necron would actually stand. I then moved on to the Black Templar, and I did consider removing the symbols for the Black Templar, maybe making this guy into a Blood Angel, because Dead Blood Angels is a theme of my armies, because I play against Blood Angels quite a lot. However, I want people to see that this is the 35-year anniversary miniature, so I decided to actually keep it as a Black Templar. Plus, I've never painted a Black Templar before, so I thought that would be pretty cool to do as well. I then had another look at the Necron. What I've noticed about this Necron is the elbow joints is where you actually glue the arms on, and I thought that was quite a weak spot, so I thought I would actually pin those joints. So I drilled a little hole into the elbow of the actual model and into the actual arm so that I could pin them on with a paper clip. Next, I had to cut off the rocks that are on the bottom of the staff. Again, I just gently cut it off with my knife. I had to actually cut into the rocks and then across, so that actually some of the rocks became the bottom of the staff, because the staff was actually embedded into the rocks. It was pretty simple to do, and I managed to do it. So I'd worked out the feet position of the Overlord, and the back straight leg was going to stand on the claw because it's quite a flat piece, and I thought that would be an ideal place to pin this miniature to. So I drilled a hole in his foot. I made sure I did it in his heel so that I could get the drill going right the way through the leg, a nice long pin. And then I drilled a hole into the actual claw where he was going to stand. I just used a paper clip and just used that as the pin. Now, of course, it's a plastic miniature, but the paper clip is metal, so you need to use super glue when you're actually gluing in the metal pin. Once I'd done the first foot, I then worked out where the second foot was going to go, and I put a pin in the second foot as well. Then I had to think about how I'm going to have the Marine in the air. Like I said, originally I was going to have the Necron sort of holding him by the neck, but I didn't actually have a hand that was going to do that. and I came up with an idea of the resurrection orb being used as a weapon. I could imagine lightning coming from the orb and then the lightning sort of hitting the Marine, so I could have maybe a paperclip sort of in the form of lightning just holding the whole thing together. I thought that would be pretty cool. So I drilled 3 holes in the orb, 2 on the outside, 1 at the top, and then I got some paper clips and I cut the paper clips up and I bent them into a lightning type shape, and then I glued them into the holes in the orb. I left the paper clips quite long so that I could work out how the Marine was going to be. I was thinking he could be in like a backwards pose. Ideally, I would like to actually keep the Marine in the same pose that he is. I think his legs are dangling quite well. He looks like he could potentially be attacked by this orb, and he's sort of holding the sword in the same position he was actually holding it when he was trying to impale the orc. So I got the Marine and I worked out exactly where these 3 points would meet into the Marine. I thought 1 on each leg and maybe 1 into his chest. So I drilled 3 holes into the Marine where I wanted these pins to go, and then I trimmed down the paper clips so they were all the right length. So this is where all of my problems started. With the Marine pinned onto the little elbow joint, the Marine was quite heavy, and what happened is the paperclip basically just bent. The weight was just too much. So I took the pin out and I actually used a drill piece, a 1mm drill piece, and I cut that up and I used that as the pin, much stronger than of course a paperclip. I thought I'd solved my problems. However, what happens next is the weight broke the wrist of the arm. So now the wrist was broken, and the wrist of course is quite thin. It was going to be impossible to pin the wrist, so I decided I would try to magnetise the miniature instead. First though, I drilled 3 more holes into the orb and I added 3 more pieces of lightning that weren't attached to the actual Marine, just to make the effect look more realistic. So back to the wrist, I just cut the wrist off, the 2 little sort of plastic tubes that make up the wrist. And then I drilled a 2mm hole into the arm, and I drilled a 2mm hole into the hand. I then glued in a 2x1mm N52 strength magnet into each of the holes and let them dry. I then got another 2x1mm magnet and I superglued that onto the magnet that was on the arm. However, this didn't work. The Marine was just too heavy and the magnets weren't strong enough or big enough, and the model just sort of swang around and it was a disaster. So I felt I had no choice, but I was just going to glue the Marine to the magnet and that would be job done. I then had a look at the orc again on the base, because there's a flat section where the actual Marine is supposed to be standing with his foot. So I had to cover that somehow, and I decided to make some green stuff crystals. This is just some leftover green stuff that I'd previously rolled into a tube for this particular reason, because they make cool crystals. So I just cut it up into the shape of a crystal and I just glued 2 crystals onto the base. So the Marine is currently pinned at the elbow with the very strong pin. As I said, I used a drill bit as opposed to a paper clip. And I thought it would be pretty cool if maybe I could just have a normal arm on there rather than the actual Marine. Potentially for gameplay, it just might be easier. So I found an arm with an orb on it in my bits box. So I cut the arm off at the elbow, I drilled a hole in it, and now I can just pin on the normal arm with the orb, or I can have the Marine on there. And that was the conversion complete. I am really happy how he turned out. As I said, at one point I wasn't quite sure the conversion was actually going to work, but it did. I persevered with it, and one thing you have to take from this, if you take anything at all, is that conversions and cutting miniatures up, it can go wrong, but you can make the conversion work. You just have to be a little bit inventive. Anyway, let me know what you think of this conversion in the comments box below. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. I can't wait to paint him. He's going to be a lot of fun, and if you want to see him painted up, then don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, here is a playlist with all of my other Necron conversions for you to watch next.